You.
I'm good. Good morning.
Good morning.
How are
Is
you?
it raining down there? It's raining here.
Yeah,
So
it's
it's a
still
good thing.
raining.
It's a good thing your class is dialing in, no?
Yeah, I wanted to go in person. Hi, Madison. Good morning.
Hi, good morning.
This is Dr. Kim Nin. Madison is one of the students in the class. She loves art history and is always writing about Southeast Asian art.
Oh, wonderful.
I'm fascinated by it. I think it's beautiful.
What do you have a particular art form that you like, or is it a particular country's art that's appeal to you? Or array?
Well, I actually just started researching Thai art specifically for
Ah,
an essay that we're doing.
mm-hmm.
And I didn't realize that there was so much influence from Buddhism in India. So
Yes,
that was really fascinating. I love the Buddha sculptures and learning about like how they make them. That was super cool.
wonderful. So
Yes. Madison is brilliant. She is one of the brightest students in the class who's always very detailed about her post on Southeast Asian art. So I really appreciate her because she really like she takes the photographs, shares it with us, and she goes into the details.
that's wonderful. And it's wonderful to have a community within a class as well, right? One thing I want to say, Joy, before we start, is that I'm going to keep it fairly casual because I really want it to be an interactive conversation between me and the students. And so it's going to be a mix of personal experiences and of course my professional experience. When it comes to question and answer, obviously the student can speak up, but if there question coming on the chat portion of this, can you manage that for me? Because I find it kind of hard to sort of like interact with the student at the same time trying to figure out what if there are questions coming on the chat function.
Oh, absolutely. But I'm gonna ask the students now to please don't put stuff on the chat because it's also
Okay,
hard for me to manage. Just speak up
that's a
and
good idea. It
if
gets very
you can
distracting.
if you can please turn on your videos because it's then we can see your faces. That would be great. So let's start. It's 10 a.m. Oh, is it? No, it's 9:59. Let's wait one more minute. But
Sure.
I'm so excited to have you here with us, Kim, and let's wait for more people to come.
Sure.
Uh, but Emily, those of you who are here, did you wanna say something? Can you turn on your videos?
While we're waiting, I would love to hear from some of you as to why you're interested in this course. Why are you interested in Southeast Asia?
Great question.
And everybody is shy.
Well, I'll tell you one thing that a lot of them told me from last year and this year is they want to understand their mother or their father or their grandparents better.
I see.
Their mother won't and their father won't talk to them. So they take the
True.
class. And then other students, they really are very interested in, curious about Southeast Asian art, like Madison.
Mm-hmm.
And well, why don't we hear from you? Can you answer Dr. Nin's question?
Come on, you guys are not that shy.
Okay, let's start. It's 10
Okay.
a.m. It's a great honor and pleasure to have Dr. Kim Nin with us this morning. She is one of the most dedicated, ethical, public-spirited historians, scholars I've ever met, who cares profoundly about Southeast Asia. She's had a very distinguished career from very humble beginnings. It's not in her website bio, but Dr. Kim Nin went to school in Richmond, California, which is a very tough neighborhood. I know because I taught there. I remember telling Kim, how on earth did you survive this school system? It's awful. So she went to public school in Richmond. Those of you who know where Richmond is, you know what the deal is. And then she went on to do her BA, like many of you in the UC system, UC Berkeley. And then she went on to Yale to do her master's and PhD. And I met her for the first time in 1999 in the Australian National University in Canberra, where we were both Henry Luce Fellows. We were both turning our PhD dissertations into a book. So I've known her for 25 years, and she's one of the most inspiring human beings I've ever met. So she's a senior advisor to the Asia Foundation. Many of you have looked at the link, I think, and the blogs and the videos of her working in Myanmar and Vietnam. She was the country representative to Vietnam from 2005 to 2013, and the country representative to Myanmar from 2013 to 2018. Those of you who are from that region, from Vietnam and from Myanmar, would know that it's a very tough neighborhood, even tougher than Richmond. So to be able to live in all these places and know all these languages takes a lot of dedication and discipline and training. She is a master of the art of exile. Many of you went to the panel on the art of exile, right? And in the past 25 years, she and I often have these intense conversations about what is home, where is home, which is also what many of you are asking in your essays, your discussions. So lastly, she's a profoundly critical analyst who's also very diplomatic, which is very hard to do. So without further ado, I'm going to give the floor to Dr. Ninh, and she's going to speak for 25 minutes and then have an interactive discussion with you. So thank you so much, Kim.
Thank you very much, Joy. I always, whenever Joy asks me to do something, I always say yes, because Joy is such a passionate, intense person, particularly in engaging with younger students. And she's always pushed me to do more in terms of mentoring, given my experiences. And so I'm always happy to speak or to join whatever Joy is up to. So thank you very much for the invitation, Joy, and welcome to all on a rather dreary February morning. What I would like to do today is very much make this a very casual engagement, a conversation among us. I will give you a little bit of my background and then into my professional career, particularly talking about international development, because that's the field I've been working in for more than 2 decades since I finished my PhD. And then a little bit about where Southeast Asia is now situated in the context of international development now, and then just open up for conversation. And in that regard, feel free to ask me any and all questions you may have about my background, about my interest, as well as my work experiences and my views on whatever issues is on top of mind for you. So I finished my PhD in 1996, and that was a degree I did at Yale, and I did a degree in political science. And I would just say briefly here that in my generation of first generation immigrant at that time, almost no one ever think about doing anything in the liberal arts and in the social sciences. And so, and that has been a wonderful change over time, I think, that I see in a younger generation, because you are, many of you are born here. Many of you are don't have any issues regarding language, whereas in my years, one of the big issues is English, and of course family. You want to make sure that you are, as the first generation, and your family is in economic need, that you have to be practical. You have to find a job when you get out of school. So at that time, you see a lot of Asians themselves moving into that, and also being channeled by their teachers in school, for example, into fields like computer science, like engineering, and so on. So it's a combination of both. I think there is a stereotype of Asians, but there's also an internal dimension in need. So it was a relatively rare situation for someone like me at that time to go into political science. And I'll tell you a little joke also, is that I started out at Berkeley as a chemical engineering student. And within the first year, I can tell that this just wasn't where my heart is. And so I shifted out of it. So you see, I was also caught in the beginning. It wasn't an easy thing to do. But I particularly interested in the political science because I was interested in learning how the world's society and economy is shaped. And the political science as a field help you to have the structure to understand the formation of societies and economies and the like. I hear a little bit from what Georgia said, that for many of you, to understand your own history from your family is a very different thing than to actually pursue it as a study. And so first of all, not a lot of people talk about it in the family in the first place. And second, it is from their particular perspective. And so oftentimes you don't have a fuller picture of where you're coming from. And so that was also another factor that pushing me to pursue a degree in political science. And in fact, I did a double degree in political science and English literature because I just love literature. And so there's always that aspect of politics and art and culture mingled together in all of my work from the very beginning. And so when I finished a PhD, and usually what you do is you go into teaching. But again, I was particularly interested in looking at a way in which I can engage with the world in a much more problem-solving aspect than a purely academic one. And so that led me into looking at international development, and I joined the Asia Foundation right fresh out of the PhD, and I was very grateful that they took me on as someone with very little experience, even though I had that academic training, and that's how I began my career in international development. And so international development is a fascinating arena, and I wouldn't be surprised if some of you may be interested in that as a career later on, and we can talk about that. And I'm happy to have a chat offline as well to any of you who's interested in that direction. But it took me to many countries in the region, the Asia Foundation being the Asia Foundation, the focus was primarily on Asia. And so I get to work in many countries in the region, and then eventually head the Asia Foundation office in Vietnam. And when the Myanmar opening up back in the early 2000, where there was a moment of real hope for the country, with the military stepping back and giving room for democratic transition, I really lobbied hard so that I can open the office there in Myanmar. And part of that too is personal. For me, going to Vietnam was so fascinating because that was my country of birth. And that was also a time of opening and re-engaging in the region and in the world from a position of a pariah state. And similarly for Myanmar at that point, it was the last country in mainland Southeast Asia to actually, again, have that kind of democratic opening up. So I was particularly fascinated to join that endeavor in the country. And so I did that and then left in 2018 after 5 years there. And again, we can talk about my experience in Myanmar as in the Q&A. So what I want to just chat a little bit to you is sort of the evolution of international development in the past few decades. Now, in the beginning, what constitutes international development in the beginning was very much part of the colonial enterprise, right? countries, particularly country from the West, who colonized countries, whether in Africa or in Asia or in other parts of the world, provided funding and support and economic support, infrastructure support to their colonies earlier on. So in the post-colonial period, some of that continued, but over time, particularly after World War II, driven by wars, driven by global poverty, there emerged a consensus in globally that countries in need really need to be supported to develop because there became a much more expansive definition of international development in the views that if countries are economically developed, it's less likely to be affected by conflict. And so there became a much wider definition of international development. And so that's what we begin to see post-World War II. And over time, what's become interesting is that it became professionalized, right? Many of you now know that you can actually go for an MA in program related to international development. Now that's a relatively new development. It's probably in the last 20, 30 years or so that it become much more professionalized. Now that comes with pluses and minuses. Again, we can talk about that at another point. But what it has become is that it become a field. There's a lot more, and I would just focus on one aspect of it is that increasingly then in a lot of these countries that providing international development, what you have increasingly is a department, ministry separated from foreign affairs, right? Because that was viewed as a distinct focus, that it should be independent from foreign policy, right? Because we're here to support this country to develop. And so many times these kind of international development ministry or department tend to take on the focus on poverty reduction, for example, as its main goal. So for a long time, for example, whether Australia, Sweden, or the UK, the international development side is a distinct, separate unit from foreign affairs, right? And that show you how much things had changed up to that point. But what happened again as this evolved over time is that and I must say that if you look at the global poverty rate alone as an indication, then I think it has been tremendous. This is not only because of international development, but also because of economic development. And a lot of that was actually channeled through whether it's economic support or technical support for many countries to develop their markets, right? Trading arrangements, preferential trades, all of these kind of instruments that really helped to drive global poverty rate over the decades down. And I think something like in the 1990s, you see almost 50% global poverty rate down now to probably about 10% now today. That's an extraordinary change. And if we look at in Asia alone, which comprise a big factor of that decrease in global poverty rate, it has been China. Billions of people have come out of poverty in China, and that helps drive the global poverty rate down significantly, right? And a lot of that came through a time when China decided to open up, and there was an enormous amount of goodwill and support and funding, international aid that went to China to support that whole process. It's interesting now that China has become such a big player in the global economy that we sometimes forget the extraordinary support and goodwill that went into supporting China's emergence into the world, and particularly on poverty change. But what I would say now is that in the past 10 years, again, we are seeing an evolution of that change in the international development sector. What you see now, it used to be that primarily the key players are states, right? And then you have foundations, and then you have a little bit of philanthropists. But over the past decade, 15 years or so, you've seen an explosion of actors in this space. there's states, foundations are still there, but you have much bigger players in terms of you get many much richer foundation, many of them coming out of the tech sector, for example. You have notions like social enterprise, for example, that's driving a different way of looking at international development. And then, of course, you also have newer states entering this space. It used to be mostly primarily the states in the West that are driving the global agenda on international development. But now you have countries like Korea join this club. China emerged hugely in this space, for example, in the past decades or so, with a very different vision and a different approach to international development than previously. So all of that means there's a lot more competition. There's a lot more sometimes divergent perspective on how to do development, and so country there's also and part of this is coming within a time when there's a lot of global restructuring of power, right? We used to be able to say that there was a preeminent position for the U.S. in the post-World War II environment. And increasingly, that's no longer the case. And so what you're seeing is much more multipolar type of power structure globally. And that had also led increasingly to the notion that international aid increasingly should be tied to a country's specific foreign policies. So in the past 10 years, increasingly, we've seen that has become a big change in international developments. So Australia has consolidated its international development arm into foreign policy. Sweden has done the same. Canada has done the same. And the UK has done the same. So now you're seeing a much more consolidated perspective of aid as part of the foreign policy, as part of the national interest, right? The U.S. Has not gone that far because the USAID, which is the American version of the International Aid Agency, has always been part of foreign affairs, but nevertheless. There's a much clearer now focus on the national interest in aid. So I want to stop there. The last thing that I want to mention is that earlier I highlighted the fact that there's a just checking on time, Joy. I mentioned just now this global transformation in terms of the power structure. What's interesting in the past 10 years has been the emergence of this notion of the Indo-Pacific. And that is now, if you're looking at that, you can also see driving a lot of policies, including aid policies for a number of countries. And what I would say, the Indo-Pacific is a frame of reference that take into consideration this sort of geographical area between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean flowing together as one, which is fairly new, because before we tend to talk about the Asia Pacific, or we talk about the Pacific, so there has not been this kind of expensive linking of the two oceans like this, and basically looking and bringing India into this conversation about Asia in a way that hasn't been done before. And this was driven primarily by Japan, who saw the emergence of China and really wanted to make sure that there's a framework that would help link together countries of similar interests to engage with China. And over time, what I find interesting is that it has become now a well-established framework globally now to look at what's happening in the regions. And so many countries now have an Indo-Pacific strategy, including the US, of course, but also France, Germany, globally now, many countries are using this frame of reference to look at what's happening in China. And in that context, Southeast Asia is particularly a focal point in this framework. because it's situated really centrally in the midst of all of this. And ASEAN, which I'm sure Joy had mentioned in class before, which is a group of 10 countries joined together in sort of a loose arrangement, has increasingly become the focal point for global interest in looking at what's happening in Asia. So if you haven't yet, take a look at what the Indo-Pacific is about. I would recommend having a quick review of that strategy, which is driving now the policy of many countries in engaging with the region economically, militarily, but also aid. So let me just stop there and let us sort of engage in a conversation, or I can obviously detail anything that I've said, because that's quite a wide-ranging set of issues. To explain further detail, anything further that may not have been clear to you. So let me just leave it there. Joy, let me turn it back to you.
Thank you so much, Kim. You must have a lot of questions, comments. I'm going to give the floor to all of you so we can have an interactive discussion. Joseph.
Hello, yes, thank you for the talk. I thought that was very interesting. I was wondering, because I don't know, because like I'm not involved in international aid, I don't have a very good idea of it, but I've gotten the impression that a lot of it, especially if we're talking in terms of the US historically, and like in Africa, for instance, a lot of it is like, here, let's loan you a bunch of money as long as you use it in ways that also benefits us. And obviously that's kind of how foreign policy works, right? You want to bolster your own situation while also providing things that the other person would want so that they cooperate, more or less. So in that context, I'm kind of wondering if that's an accurate perception, and then also if, as you say, the dynamics are shifting and there are more different players in the game of interacting with aid in this way and international development, how that affects that, and whether that's like something that sort of democratizes it and makes it more actually helpful for countries now that there are more options, or if it just becomes a power struggle.
Complicated questions, as you can imagine. I would say that I think it's easy for us to be cynical about international development. But in my experience, I've met so many people who are genuinely in it because they want to help to make good changes in people's lives. And this is where I kind of mentioned that there was one point when it was a much more expensive notion of international development, in that we are here to support the transformation of a society or help people's lives in basic needs. So there's been amazing things done in terms of clean water, in terms of sanitation, in terms of basic education, making sure that young women in particular can go to schools, and that will continue in many parts of the world. But the reality is that it is in the context of power structure. So you will see aspects of a particular policy, and it will be dependent on a particular country. So there will be aspects that one can get quite cynical about, right? Why are we doing this when the country needs this? But one other aspect I would say also is that over time, for the 50 years or so of international aid, what has changed also is that we have built up, when it's done right, has been also building up local capacity, for local organizations to come up, for local media to come up, in order to sort of like gradually take over that space. So another area that I've seen over time is also there's a great deal of interest in localization of a lot of these international aid venture. but it's quite a mixed bag, because say in some countries, in some country the interest is to localize it, and so you want to give the money to the government to do the work that they need to do with their people, right? Instead of it become trapped in a kind of international or foreign aid or Western implementation. But oftentimes, not oftentimes, but sometimes the particular country government can be quite corrupt. So the money doesn't necessarily go to their people either, and therefore there are times when it is really important to still have a kind of like a transition. And oftentimes international organizations work closely with local organizations, for example, as kind of like a barrier between the government and the public in order to make sure that things happen. So it really is a mix. It depends on the country you're talking about, depending on the process. I work in international development for a long time, so sometimes one can get quite cynical about it. And yet at the same time, I have seen so many examples of committed people who work together. And I think we can also, the other thing that I want to say is that we can also easily get caught in these conceptualizations of what's local, what's international. So oftentimes I would ask that we focus on what is the outcome of a particular enterprise. If these people are engaged in this way, what is the outcome? And if the outcome is what we want for benefit the largest number of people, that's what we should look at. Because I think even the kind of the narrative or the kind of conceptualization around aid can also get caught in first world, third world, south, north. And so there too, I think we need to tease that out and see ultimately what is who benefit from all of this, and is it the outcome that we want? I know it's a bit complicated of an answer, but I hope that helped to answer some of your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Any more questions, comments? Rati, Ethan?
Yeah, hello. I just wanted to ask, just because your line of work seems very diverse, and considering that you work based on Myanmar and Vietnam, I just wanted to ask, was there something surprising about working about or from those areas, or was there like something inspiring that kept you moving forward in in your research and in your career?
I think ultimately for me, it's about people. I mean, there's a particular interest for me with Vietnam, obviously, because that's the country of my birth. But it's a process of getting to understand and know a country from my own perspective, instead of being filtered through what my parents' views are, which can be quite difficult because they've gone through a very traumatic situation. So to come to it from a position of learning, research on my own was very meaningful for me. And then getting a chance to actually live in the country for almost 10 years to work on issues related to governance, economic development, social development, gender issues. That was really useful for me. As for Myanmar, I think, as I mentioned earlier, I was just so fascinated by this being the last country that able to, at that time, was very hopeful. There was that was very hopeful in the sense of a democratic transition. And so that was my particular interest, and to be able to explore a new country in Southeast Asia was also so fascinating, and not from a distant perspective, but actually from actually living and working there was what really fascinated me.
Yeah, thank you. And I guess just to piggyback off of that, since I guess you can say like you've had a very long and extensive career, what is some like advice that you would give to like undergraduates like us to just keep going if we choose a very long career path?
Life is long. I I think that two, you have to have a certain amount of passion in what you want to do, what really engage you. And and the other thing I would say, looking back, is that you have to feel that a couple of things. I wish when I was younger, I didn't have to worry so much about not knowing something. I wish I have the confidence to understand that I have a place in the world as much as anyone else. Now you have to remember, I feel this way because I came when I was quite young. I was 11 when I came, and that was in 1976, and it's very much part of the refugees experience. So you feel I didn't speak English. So there was so much, and my parents didn't understand, didn't have the information about college to really help me. So much of it where you're navigating on your own, right? So there was for a long time that sense of sort of, you have to have the grit, but you fight in silence. And I think now, I hope that it's different for you, but I see how, a sense in which there is no silly question to ask. And to have the confidence to being in the world, to know that that's your place, and to ask questions. This is important for everyone, but particularly for young women. I think is that there is no questions too basic. There is no question too silly. Being open to that engagement with the world is important. So that's probably what I would say. Don't feel that you don't have a place in this world to pursue your interests and your dreams. The other thing I would say is that related to that, I would urge all of you to reach out to people whom you are you find fascinated, have some issue that you're interested in. Reach out to them. Don't be shy. Ask them for an information interview. I think that in my position, I get a lot of that request, and I'm always happy to have a more extended conversation with those young people. And I'm pleased that they have the wherewithal to reach out, to ask questions. And that's one of the best way for you to learn, to have more information, but also to establish and maintain contact with mentors. So I would definitely suggest that.
Yeah, thank you for your kind words. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kim. Rati, So, Abby, and then Minson. And if you have questions, just open your mic because I can't see everybody's hand. Go ahead.
Hi. So, my specific question was a little bit similar to Ethan's, but specifically, were there any women that inspired you while working in global policy and like within like that field? And if not, was there anything like involving like working with women or reading about or like seeing people within Southeast Asia like that inspired you or like that you found particularly interesting?
So many. So many. It's hard for me to pinpoint one, but I mean, what I also find fascinating over the years is that you have these women who are, and this could range in a number of areas. I've seen women working in the private sector that's been extraordinary. I've seen women who work in the nonprofit sector, gender-based violence, working working to make sure to get women into politics, for example, because the political rate for women participation is always low. So over time, it's been an extraordinary number of people that I have met that is hard to pinpoint. An area where we've worked in a number of places, it seems simple. But for example, to make sure that young women can go to school. In Vietnam, for example, we actually focus on if we can, because oftentimes in a family, if you have to choose, the family would choose to get the boy to go to school and the girls would stay home to deal with housework, for example. So in instances like that, we've had scholarships to make sure that the girls can go to school, at least to high school, because their life would change if they can manage up to high school. Instead of dropping off. So there's a number of different ways in which you can engage in this related to women, and the number of women leaders in Asia is extraordinary. But it's an interestingly complex situation, because if you look at places like Japan and Korea, where you would think women's participation or women's situation would be so much better in other places. Actually, if you look at the number, the rate of labor participation and gender rights and so on is still very difficult in those environments as well. So it raises the question why. So it's always interesting working in this arena, because it's a mix of structure, institution, politics, but also culture. Right. One area that I'm fascinated in, for example, in South Asia, where there has been an increasing number of women participation in labor over the past few decades, right? But as these countries, in India, so one interesting emerging development, which people are still trying to figure out what's going on there, is that as the country get richer, actually the women started to retreat back into the home. And so the question is why? Because usually it's the reverse, right? In many economies, is that women then continue, the rate of labor participation continue rather than decrease. And one of the areas where people say that it possibly could be is that in South Asia, it's a sign of privilege that a woman in a household get to the point where they don't have to go to work. So that's an interesting, now it's unclear whether that's entirely the reason, but it's an interesting aspect to tell you how much culture can also affect the gender equation, right? Even in situation where economic growth is improving. So what I found interesting is that the complexity of the issues, but also just a number of really smart, sharp, clear, analytical, sophisticated women that have emerged across Asia in the private sector, in government, and in the nonprofit sector to address a lot of these issues. And in the media as well, some of the most courageous work has been done by women journalists, say, for example, in the Philippines. So the number of women that are inspiring are in many ways countless. We can talk offline if you're interested more in those issues. I can point you to some of the, but almost in every single one of these countries, you can pinpoint extraordinary leaders. In the Philippines, for example, I've been very fascinated and inspired by the work of the latest Nobel Prize winner who's done an extraordinary job in pushing forward journalism in the Philippines. And Joy would probably know even more about that than I do.
Thank you so much.
So then Abby Minson.
Hi, good morning. Sorry.
Good morning.
Hi, my name is Sake. One of the See, I was born in Thailand refugee camp, so I have like a background in Myanmar as my parents were born there. So I'm curious to like to ask you more about what you learned there when you were working in Myanmar.
Mm.
What do you think is needed for its development? Um, like for the whole populations of ethnic groups.
So Myanmar is tough. The ethnic situation is so tough in Myanmar. I've never seen anything like it, and it's been so embedded for so long. And it probably my time in Myanmar is some of the most inspiring, but also most heartrending. Partly, so I would just say a couple because this required sort of like such a long conversation, right? And we can have that offline if you like at some point. There's so many things that Myanmar need to address deeply that it just had never had time to address because of the military control over the country for the past, 50, 60 years. The effect of the colonial period has never been addressed because everything gets suppressed by the military for so long, so that in some ways, Myanmar society is kind of like trapped in amber. It never had a chance, like many of these countries in the region, has to force themselves to address issues about colonialization, issues about democratization, and that's decades long experience, right? And in Myanmar, they never had that. The issue of ethnicity is so embedded in Myanmar that has to be addressed. The issue of religion, for example, the issue of class, even through all of that, so much has not been addressed. So I think that would be the one big thing that I would say about my time in Myanmar. The other thing is that because of that, so many people cheer on the democratic movement in Myanmar for good reason. I mean, it's such a brave thing right now and before. But what I also observe in Myanmar is that, again, because of this suppression of conversation, of learning, of addressing, of coming to terms with so many issues in Myanmar, democratic understanding, the understanding of democracy in Myanmar is very thin. Because the time I was there, we did a number of national survey to try to understand, and the understanding of democracy is very thin. And so in that sense, in the long run, it will pose a dilemma for Myanmar in the long run. And at the moment, because the way in which things are developed was developed under such duress. So there's much more emphasis on the bravery of the action than the long-term, deep-seated understanding of what will make a society that everyone can live together. So I think that was still going to be a big challenge for Myanmar. What does it take? How will you structure whatever the emergent political entity and society to make sure that everybody can live together? Because for so long, that military mindset, I would say, had also infiltrated even those who think of themselves as democratic. Do you understand what I mean? It seemed kind of contrarian, but you live in that society, so you're not removed from how things work. So the understanding of ethnicity in Myanmar is really much has been constructed by the military. And in many ways, that continue to resonate even within the Bamar population, for example, who supported democracy, right? So I think that actually was an eye-opening conversation of the 10 years of opening we recently have. And now, given yet again another big military uprising against the military, I hope that this will give the space for this really difficult, and it's a very difficult conversation about how do you structure, how do you come to terms with it. But will all the different factions be able to agree? That's going to be a really difficult thing for Myanmar. But my goodness, the extent to which people fight for what they believe in, I find that so extraordinary in Myanmar. And that has both plus and negative side, right? Because sometimes compromises are really hard to come by in Myanmar because people are so rigid sometimes in terms of their ideological commitment, which is so inspiring, but oftentimes it can also makes it very difficult to compromise. I hope I didn't speak out of line, Saul, but that's some of the things that I saw in Myanmar that I thought inspiring, but also makes it very difficult to find a long-term solution for ethnic, religion, and class issues in Myanmar.
Thank you very much.
We only have 4 minutes left,
Oh,
and
goodness.
we don't want to abuse.
I will be quick in my answer.
But no. But you can always send questions, I think by email. So we had several hands up, but I think we can only take one more question. So Abby, then Minson, and then Emir and Janice. Yeah. Go ahead, Abby.
Hi. So you mentioned before how you've had to separate your personal biases like for Vietnam and like the academic like learning of Vietnam. Like how have you been able to like separate those two? And like also what is like the difference between like the academic like learning of Vietnam and like your own personal and your family history with Vietnam? Because for me, like I'm Vietnamese American and like my family has told me like their own personal biases from before and after like 75.
Right. I mean, it's not to discount what they have to tell you, but it's just that they come to it from their own personal perspective. So they don't always have a lot of the facts around a particular issue, for example, right? So for you, you have the luck, you have the benefits of so much more information and knowledge and books and articles and the like written out there. So for me, that was a big search to go and have all that information, to access that, and then learning the language. It's really important because I think that sometimes as Vietnamese Americans, we think we know it, but we know it from a very slanted perspective. And so you have to take a step back, learn a language, do the reading, talk to many different people, particularly those who have done research in Vietnam, for example. So even for me, when I was there and I was looking in the archives of Vietnam, I brought out information that a lot of people, researchers in Vietnam, thought they knew, and they didn't because they couldn't access the archive. But just from your own personal perspective, you have so much more information that could validate or counter what family history can tell you, and that could enrich that family history, but it can also help balance it. In your own interaction with the material and in your own interaction with your family and your family history. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you so much.
Kim, are you able to take one more question?
Sure.
Minson?
Yeah, I had a question, and it's a bit of a digression from international development, but it's kind of a question about like the refugee status and immigration to the U.S. And I don't have the background or the theory to kind of propose like a mechanism for this, but I know that a lot of Vietnamese American refugees and immigrants, and this happens across lots of different immigrant populations, like for example, like in Florida, like the Cuban immigrant or refugee population, that a lot of first generation immigrants tend really conservative, and their politics tend to be a bit reactionary as compared to the like younger like second generation immigrants or even like native born citizens. So I was just kind of wondering if this is something that you'd taken time to think about, or have any insight on?
It is interesting. I mean, you can't help but be part of it, right? Because that's how we, that's the context where we grow up in. Let's just take Vietnam, for example. There's a lot of similarity with Cuba, because when we came, Vietnam was very much closed off, right? So I also here would make the distinction between refugees and immigrant in my own mind, because too often now people say Vietnamese immigrant. There's some that can be made in that category because for example, they join a family. It was a planned program. But I do make a distinction because as refugees, you are escaping something. So your notion, your sense of yourself is very different. That's what I think. Personally, that's what I think. So and that tend to get blurred now with people just talking about immigrant as if it's all the same. So when we came, Vietnam was very much, there are so many of, my parents' generation thought we could never go back to Vietnam. That's it. That's the end, right? So you may not realize how when we first came to the U.S., it was very, very painful. And there was so much survivor guilt, basically, right? My parents couldn't eat meat for so long because keep thinking about all the people they left behind. I'm sure it's probably similar, sort of like the Cuban population. So therefore, their sort of engagement with the old country is very different. It's both very painful because it's something that they left behind. Of course, they came when they were already in their 40s and 50s, right? Different than me, but I can sense how painful it was. So when that whole thing started to open up, there was a lot of conversation. Can we trust the communists? Right? They say that they're going to do this and that. Can we trust? So like when the younger public like me started to say, oh, I want to go there, I want to do research, my parents were very hesitant. And in retrospect, I can really understand why. I mean, after all, we escaped on a boat, we almost died, they did all that. They saw a lot of pain and suffering in Vietnam. So how could they just sort of believe, right? And they, so that rupture, I think, still exists within the Vietnamese American community because we're still relatively young here, in terms of a few generations removed. But in my generation, as things are opening up, I wanted to be able to engage with the country on my own terms. But it was very scary, when I first went to Vietnam because no Vietnamese American went back in the 1980s. And to go to the north, which is like impossible, So we will engage. Our views will change based on the generation and based on what's happening. So for you now, for example, you can go to Vietnam and it's just a matter of like any other country, you pick up your visa and you go. Whereas it used to be so much more difficult, and that history remains. I'm fascinated by what is the current Vietnamese American generation political perspective on Vietnam and on the U.S., but that's for another time. But it does vary from generation to generation, and in terms of what's happening. So I find that's fascinating. But probably one of the saddest thing I would just say out of all this is that in some ways, South Vietnam and that particular country that existed for some time, basically in many ways disappear now, right? Because we don't really, your generation doesn't really know it and doesn't really have a sense of it, and it just become a footnote in history. And that and the comparison between North and South disappear because for you, Vietnam now is the whole country of Vietnam, which is nominally communist, still socialist, but that's the entity you interact with. Whereas for us, even for me, coming at 11, it's a bifurcated engagement with something that is North, but there is also something South. So that's where the complexity lies, and the politics kind of arrange along those lines too. But I'm fascinated by the notion of how, what is the political views within the Vietnamese American generation now toward Vietnam, but also in the US. I don't think there's any definitive answer, but just to want to give you a sense of how different it was. One last thing I would say. Now, when I went to Vietnam, again, back in the 1980s, I could not say, I had to hide that fact from many people within the Vietnamese American community, because if you look back a little bit in that historical record, that period, quite a number of Vietnamese American was actually assassinated, killed, because they were interested in going to Vietnam. They were interested in re-engaging. They were interested in seeing family by hardliners within the Vietnamese American community in the US, seeing them as just basically supporting the communists. So I just mentioned that fact alone, because just to underscore how difficult and how political it was at that time, of a gap between the possibility to engage, right, which is so different for you now, in viewing Vietnam now.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for all your questions, Kim. I feel so bad. It's 10:57, but would you mind just listening to 2 more questions? And
Sure, we're here. Let's do it.
In like a few minutes. So Emir and then Janice, if you could both ask your questions first, and then Kim will answer, and then we have to wrap up. We're so grateful for you taking time to do this. Emir and Janice?
I don't know if it's just me, but I don't see Amir in the group call anymore. I think a lot of people are leaving because it is 11. But if you don't mind then asking
Sure.
my question. So I remember you were talking near the end of your like 20-minute discussion about like East Asia and its relationship to Southeast Asia. And I know your field is about international development. So I was actually curious because I'm East Asian myself, like I'm Korean, and I hear lots of stories about how like my country, like we were destitute and poor near the end of the war, and then over the course of just a couple of decades, we're like top 20 in the global sphere. But as this development continues, we continue to see like that gap between East Asia's prosperity and Southeast Asia's is like continual like struggle to thrive. Like not saying, but then there's that still that like there's something like to want, right, in terms of like global influence, and like these communities are still being like cast aside as like the third world, like the developing world. And I actually wanted to hear like your input, I guess, on how, as we keep going into the future, East Asia and Southeast Asia will continue to interact with each other and continue to like develop like alongside each other, and also your thoughts on like international aid regarding like these two Asias, I guess.
Well, I mean, I think that Southeast Asia has come a long way. So, I mean, the level of confidence in Southeast Asia and young people in Southeast Asia is so different than when I first started. I just remember being very, it just touched me so much, when I first working in Vietnam and actually started seeing at the airport, seeing people traveling for the first time, young people going off to other countries. I mean, it just is very touching to see that happening. The ability of, I mean, I think I cannot underscore how important it was for people to be able to like get on a plane and actually go and see places, or even
the ability to recover.
And the people to be able to go work in another country, right? You see these young men, it's kind of sad, touching, but that it was very hopeful for them to have a job, to actually go to Korea, as a worker, to go to Japan. So what I think is that Korea now has its own international development agency, KOICA, for example. And Korea is very proud of the fact that over time it has transitioned from an aid recipient to become an aid giver. And that's very important. Japan has long provided aid, it got started as a war reparation, right, to Asia in the aftermath of World War II, and that had continued to be a big part of Japan's foreign policy. What I think what's interesting is that there is a little bit of a competition going on, because China has provided, because Southeast Asia is in the neighborhood, so, and everybody want to have influence over the neighborhood. So China has provided a lot of infrastructure aid, for example, to a lot of countries in the region. But so does Japan, and so there's Korea. I think what over time, though, what is really important, probably less to look at in terms of, not only in terms of international aid, but to look at the economic relationship, right? The ties, the economic ties. And again, you see extraordinary investment that both Korea and Japan is making in countries in the region. So, and in many ways, Vietnam, Indonesia, Philippines, Malaysia have all benefited from this sort of economic ties. One last thing I would say, that if you're interested, you should look up inter-regional economic ties. Because I think one of the development that I find very fascinating now is that oftentimes when we talk about trade, we tend to talk about, product from Asia going to the West. But in fact, if you're looking at interregional trade, increasingly that amount is increasing, showing that countries in the regions are sort of becoming a network of producing for the region, right? So that's really interesting, so interregional trade is increasing. And it also shows how much that Asian taste are being created in products for Asian consumption, which is very different before than Asian are producing a product of the West for the West, right? So again, that give you a sense of how the region is emerging. The region is sort of like connectivity is increasing. And then to put influence, Asian influences now are much greater within the region and globally than it used to be, right? I mean, just look at the Korean soft power export, for example, of culture, of videos, of K-drama, of and the like. Not only in the region, but increasingly the world as well, and similar to Japan. So I find that a very interesting sort of development, the interregional connectivity in terms of economic, trade, culture, travel, and there's a sense of confidence in Asia now that I find really, really amazing compared to when I first started, 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah, thank you so much.
So lots to be hopeful about. All right, sorry.
Thank you so much for gracing our class, and thank you to all of your questions and comments. I'm sorry, I think Emir wasn't able to ask his question, but if you had more questions, you can send them via email. Please help me in thanking Dr. Ninh for sharing her inspiring experiences and vision with us today. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
It's been fun. Thank you, and best wishes to all of you. Thanks, Joy.
Oh, thank you, Kim.
Take care. Bye.
Thank you.